In this video, we're going to look at how to achieve the sickest orc skin tone in the universe.
No way!
We'll start off with some WAAAGH English uniform, which as you can see is quite a desaturated greeny brown colour. It's definitely not the usual starting colour for orc skin, but we'll make it work all the same. As usual, I'm going to paint this initial colour on over a couple of layers until it's a solid, even and smooth surface. For the first highlight, we'll mix in some WAAAGH ivory into the English uniform to get quite a light colour, and we'll paint this onto the skin on the upper parts of all the muscles. Don't worry about blending this out, we'll be doing that later. For now, you're just using the paint to map out where your highlights are going to be. The whole back of this model will be covered with a large rucksack, so I'm not going to bother painting that area just to save a bit of time. If you wanted to paint it anyway, you'd again focus on highlighting the upper parts of each muscle. Hopefully you've noticed that both the base colour and the initial highlight are both heavily desaturated. Usually you want to avoid doing that as it can lead to a very washed out and flat finish, but our plan here is to use all desaturated colours for the highlights, then at the end come back in with a paint that has a much higher saturation and use that to glaze in our shadows, and it's that final step that should bring some life back into the colour. It feels a bit weird painting with this approach because you really have to put a lot of trust into that final step. It's much the same as when you're doing non-metallic metal. It's going to look a bit crap right up until that last couple of brush strokes. So you kind of have to ignore your brain screaming at you and just trust the process instead. Hopefully watching this will give you more confidence to try it out yourself. So we're just looking over the surface of the skin and picking out the raised areas of each muscle where we want to create a highlight. Depending on the consistency of your paint, you may need to do this over a couple of layers. Just make sure you get a good solid coverage so that the colour ends up nice and strong. You don't want the base coat showing through underneath, or you'll end up with quite weak, dull highlights, and that will carry forward onto the rest of your layers, and you don't want that. Also notice there's quite a big difference between the base colour and the highlight. Don't be scared to make fairly big jumps in brightness. You don't want to make your highlights too subtle or you'll be there forever building up enough layers before you get a decent level of contrast. Once you've finished mapping those out, we'll thin down our highlight to a glaze consistency, just by adding a little water to it. Then with a small amount of the glaze on the brush, we'll start to blend out the highlights by pulling the glaze up and over the edge of each highlight. You'll need to do this over several layers, letting the glaze dry completely between each application. WAAAGH paint can be way more forgiving than scale colour, so if you've tried this approach before with scale colour and found it a bit of a struggle, try using the WAAAGH and see if you fare any better. Because we're painting skin, I want to build up some nice textures on the surface to give it a more organic feel. So as well as the normal glazing, I'll also throw in some stippling, applying little dots of the glaze on and around the highlight. This helps to both blend out the transition and also give some subtle skin texture. The model I'm working on here is fairly large, so it lends itself really well to this sort of approach. You can go back and forth between stippling and normal glazing to speed up the process. I find stippling tends to break up the surface, and then glazing over the top kind of fills in the gaps left by the stippling, so the two techniques have a really nice synergy. I can highly recommend using them in tandem like this. Don't be scared of stippling, you're really just tapping the brush gently against the surface. Some of the results you can get from it look a bit intimidating, but the process to get there is actually not as hard as you might first think. It's not like you're sitting there deliberating over where to place every single little dot. In reality, you're really just tapping the brush around on the surface. Once you've tried out a few times, it becomes second nature. Having said that, you do need to develop a soft touch with the brush, but once you get that, it's not an issue. The amount of layers you'll need to use depends on how thin you've made your glaze. A thicker glaze will take less layers, but you might find it's a bit harder to control, whereas a thinner glaze will be a bit easier in terms of application, but will take a lot longer to build up a transition. So you're really making a trade-off between speed and ease of execution, and it's up to you to find out what you're more comfortable with. The main idea behind this process is that you're stacking a series of transparent layers, and each time you add another, that transparency reduces until that hard edge around the highlight softens into a gradual transition. Alright, so on the tops of the shoulders we'll do the same sort of thing, pushing that glaze up and over the transitions to soften out the edges and create a blend. Just going back and forth between stippling and glazing in order to create a subtle texture on the surface of the skin. When you're using stippling to create a gradient, try and place most of your dots on the spot where the two colours meet, keeping them fairly close together in a tight cluster on and around the edge of the highlight. Then, as you get further away, allow your dots to gradually spread out so they become more sparse as you move away from the highlight. This allows you to create a smooth shift from one colour to the next. Combining this with glazing helps to soften the dots so that you get a more subtle texture. And we'll do the same sort of thing on the other side of the body. You can see I've already blended this out a little bit. There is a tendency to panic slightly when doing this approach because that initial highlight looks so garish and clashing, but once you start to blend it all out, it generally comes together really nicely, so try not to freak out when you place those initial highlights. I can recommend working on one small area until you get it blended out. That will help to calm any doubts that you might have. I've found that there is actually quite a big psychological aspect to painting, and it's pretty common to find yourself getting tied up in your own thoughts, with them acting sort of like hecklers shouting from the gallery.
Yes, and on a scale of 1 to 10, here's your score so far.
They'll try their best to hold you back and stop you from achieving what you set out to do if you let them. So it's good to develop little tricks to help silence those demoralising thoughts. When you see one little patch start to blend out, you quickly realise that you're going to be able to do it over the whole surface without much trouble. But if you try to do the whole thing at once, it can seem a bit daunting, and you run the risk of doubting yourself to the point where you're just going to give up. So try painting a small bit at a time. Maybe confine yourself to, say, 2 or 3 little muscles, and work on them until they're blended out before you move on to another part. That way you're breaking the whole thing up into a series of smaller, more achievable goals, and each time you finish a section, it feels like a victory, and each one is going to give you a boost in confidence, which in turn drives you forward. Alright, so now that we've successfully blended that out, we'll move on to our next highlight, and for that we're simply going to mix some more of the ivory into our colour. Again, we're making a pretty significant jump in brightness here. Don't be scared to make these quite big jumps in brightness when you're mixing your highlights, especially when you're using this blocking in approach. It speeds up the process quite a lot and it ensures that you build up a decent amount of contrast so that all the elements end up clearly defined. We'll paint this onto the model, hitting all the same spots as before, but this time only applying quite a small highlight. It's important to bear in mind that when you're doing this approach, the blending process will actually expand the highlights slightly. So when you're blocking them in, you generally want to err on the side of caution and make them a bit smaller than you actually want them to be. If you don't do that, the highlights will end up being way too big, and you'll actually start to cover up most of the work you did in the previous step. You can always make them bigger later if they turn out to be too small, and that's much easier than trying to do it the other way when you need to reduce the size of the highlights. It's good to try and think ahead when you're painting so that you avoid making things more difficult for yourself than they need to be. Once you finish that, your model is going to look completely ridiculous, but don't worry about that. Just don't put a work in progress picture on Facebook and no one's going to know. Anyway, you're going to blend this out just like you did with the first highlight, thinning the paint down with some water to a glaze consistency, and then with a very small amount on the brush, soften out the edges of each highlight by drawing the glaze up and over the edges of the transition, blurring out the hard edges. Remember that you can go back and forth between glazing and stippling to get a more interesting skin texture. When you're using glazes, it's important to bear in mind that you want to increase the surface area covered by your brush strokes. try not to use the tip of the bristles. Save that for when you're stippling. Instead, use the side of the brush. This reduces the number of brush strokes required to cover an area, thus reducing the chance of creating visible lines on the surface. Also, don't use the same brush stroke each time that you apply the glaze. You should try to vary it, altering both the angle and the length of each stroke. Some of your brush strokes should be short and straight, some long, some diagonally to the left, some diagonally to the right, and so on. If you use the same brush stroke every time, the paint will collect in the same spots, usually around the edges of the brush stroke, and that's going to leave you with noticeable lines on the surface. So by varying the length and direction, you're going to stop this from happening and create a more even coverage. You also want to make sure that you allow each layer to dry before applying a new one. If a layer is not fully dry before you apply the next one, you're most likely going to rip that delicate layer that's underneath. And over time, this creates a streaking effect, as you're essentially creating little holes in the glaze, which can be very difficult to correct, so be careful that you don't overwork a single area, and just make sure that you allow it to dry before adding a new layer. Alright, and it's just the same idea on the other parts of the skin, so we'll move on to the shading now. For that, we're going to make another glaze, this time with some Vallejo Armour Brown, a very rich, reddy brown tone, and we'll just add a couple of drops of water to that to thin it down. Then with a small amount of the glaze on the brush, we'll glaze it into the recesses to create our shadows. Armour Brown is quite a strong paint, which means it's going to change the colour of the skin quite rapidly, even as a glaze, so you need to be pretty careful here not to put it on too heavily. I'm starting in an area that is less obvious, just in case I mess up. So you're going to build up the intensity of your shadows over a few layers. It's this stage that brings a lot of life back to the skin. This is probably my favourite part of the process because you get to see it all come together. When you're doing this, I would recommend having a second clean brush ready and close at hand, just in case you make a mistake, or you need to feather out the edges of the glaze if you get too much on the surface. Alright, so I just build the shadows up over a few layers until I like the way the skin looks. You want them to make sense in that the deeper recesses should be darker than the more subtle recesses, so try not to make everything the same level of darkness. Especially on a model that's this big, you really want to build up a more varied shadow. On a smaller model, it's okay to just have a solid shadow tone across the whole thing, because it's harder for your eyes to register subtlety there. But here we have a lot more room to manoeuvre and create some more variability. In areas where you know the shadow will be very strong, you can use a slightly thicker consistency to place the shadow, then use the thinner glaze to blend up to it. So you don't have to just apply loads of thin layers until you get that strong shadow. You can just start out with that strong shadow straight away and then just blur the edges. You can see that now that we have that more reddy shadow tone in there, the skin is starting to look a lot more lifelike, and we've got rid of that slightly washed out look it had when it was just the highlights. If you like, you can add an extra level of detail by applying little dots of the Armour Brown here and there on the skin in order to simulate some kind of discoloration, perhaps a mole or just little blemishes. Try not to do too many of these though, it can be really easy to get a bit carried away when you're adding these sort of details. And round the back as well. Notice that we're still essentially using a glaze consistency for these. By using quite a thin transparent paint, we can alter the intensity of these dots to create some variation between them, making some quite subtle and others more pronounced just by retouching a dot or by simply leaving slightly more of the paint on a surface. So I think it's looking okay at this stage, but we could probably add a bit more detail here and there. So we'll paint in a few more little spots with the Armour Brown in some of the larger parts of the skin. This section here looks a bit boring, so I'll add a little spot there. And maybe some more here, just a few small dots near the shadows. All these little imperfections really help to sell the skin as being an organic surface. Adding these sort of details is a good way to fill out the space and add interest to the surfaces. Alright, I think I better stop that before I get carried away. I think it's looking pretty cool now anyway. We could maybe boost the highlights just a little bit more by mixing in a touch more ivory. And we'll use that to add a few little dots on the highest points of the highlights. You're working on quite small areas at this stage, targeting the highest points on the muscles in order to give them more shape and definition. But you're also going to be looking for opportunities to add in some small details, much like you did with the armour browns, so maybe adding some subtle scars or blemishes just to help give more life to the skin, to help give it that organic, lifelike appearance that we're going for. As I said before, this model is fairly large, so we have a bit more room to play about and add in those fiddly details that you might not be able to if you were working on a smaller scale. Here's how he looks once the rest of the model is blocked in, and you can see the skin is working really well here. If you enjoy these videos and you want to see them continue, you can become a part of our Patreon community and help to fund their production. Drop a comment and a like down below to let me know what you thought of the video, and I'll see you all next time.